My sister-in-law set my niece's backpack on my porch like it was a package she was returning after a no-questions-asked refund. No warning text, no phone call. Just a knock at my door at 6:30 on a Thursday evening. And there was Bridget, dressed like she had dinner reservations somewhere expensive, with Zoe standing 2 steps behind her in a coat that was clearly too thin for the October cold. "I need you to take her for a few days," Bridget said, smiling the way people smile when they've already decided something and are only informing you as a courtesy. She picked a piece of lint off her blazer sleeve. "Kent and I have some business to handle out of town. It's really not something she needs to be present for." I looked at Zoe. Zoe looked at me. She was 8 years old, small for her age, with her dad's dark eyes, and the same serious expression my brother Paul used to get when he was trying to understand something that didn't make sense to him. She was holding her stuffed elephant under one arm, the gray velvet one Paul had brought back from a work trip to Atlanta the year before he got sick. Her other hand was shoved deep in her coat pocket. "How long is a few days?" I asked. Bridget was already back at her car. "I'll text you," she called over her shoulder. Then she was gone. "I'm Wendy. I'm 33 years old, and I work the overnight shift in the pediatric ward at Mercy General. I've seen a lot of kids who were scared. I know what scared looks like. The held breath, the wide eyes, the way a child makes herself very still, like maybe if she doesn't move, whatever is happening won't be able to find her." Zoe was scared. I brought her inside. I made her hot chocolate, the real kind, with whole milk and cocoa powder and a little vanilla, the way Paul used to make it for her when she came to stay with him on weekends. She sat at my kitchen table and didn't say anything for a long moment, just wrapped both hands around the mug and stared at the steam rising off the top. Then she looked up at me. "Aunt Wendy," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "she didn't tell you why she needs me gone." I pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. "Then tell me," I said. She reached into the pocket of her coat and placed something flat on the table between us. It was a small white envelope, worn soft at the corners, with Zoe's name written across the front in handwriting I recognized immediately, because I had grown up watching it sign birthday cards and grocery lists and notes tucked into lunch bags. It was Paul's handwriting. My throat closed for a second. Paul had been gone 14 months. Pancreatic cancer, fast and ruthless. He'd been 41 years old. He hadn't seen it coming, and neither had any of us. "He gave it to me before he went to the hospital the last time," Zoe said. "He told me to keep it somewhere. Bridget wouldn't find it. He said if anything ever felt wrong, if I was ever scared, to find you and open it with you." I reached across the table and carefully picked up the envelope. Inside was a single folded page. Paul had written it to Zoe, but it read like he'd known I might be the one reading it first. He explained, in the careful way he used to explain everything, that the house, the 4-bedroom Craftsman on Elmbrook Lane where he and Zoe had lived, where I had spent every Christmas for the past decade, where he'd installed the tire swing in the backyard himself, had been left to Zoe in a trust. It was worth somewhere around $400,000. The trust had been drawn up by an attorney named Mr. Fowler 6 months before Paul died, without Bridget's knowledge, because Paul had not trusted her with his daughter's future. Bridget had been appointed Zoe's guardian by the probate court, only because Paul had no other immediate family willing and able to take custody at the time of his death. His instructions were in the trust documents filed with the county, and there was a notebook in his home office desk in the locked bottom drawer where the key was taped under the middle desk leg that contained a full accounting of everything. The trust documents, the account statements, every financial decision he'd made in his last 2 years. He wrote, "The house belongs to Zoe. Nobody can sell it without the court's approval and the trustees' sign-off. If Bridget tries to sell it, she's breaking the law. Don't let her. Trust Wendy. Wendy will know what to do." I sat with that letter for a moment. My hands were very steady. My chest was not. Do you know what she's doing? I asked Zoe. Zoe nodded. She's selling the house. She told Kent last week that the closing is on Monday. I heard them talking in the kitchen after dinner. She said once the money goes through, everything gets split before anyone can ask questions. She paused. I didn't know what closing meant, so I looked it up at school. It means the house is almost already sold. I looked at the date on my phone. It was Thursday. Monday was 4 days away. I kept my voice level. Zoe was watching me the way kids watch adults when they're trying to figure out whether they're about to be told. Everything is fine when it clearly isn't. I wasn't going to lie to her. Okay, I said, we're going to handle this. But I need you to do something for me. I need you to let me make some calls, and I need you to trust that I'm working on it. Can you do that? She nodded, more firmly this time. Good, I said. Now I need to ask you one more thing. Is there anything else? Anything she said? Anything you saw? Anything that felt wrong? Zoe thought about it. A man came to the house a few weeks ago. He had a briefcase. She made me go upstairs. I heard her laughing, and he kept saying things like, once this goes through, and the title transfer. After he left, Bridget went out back and burned something in the fire pit. I watched from my window. Something cold moved through me. Burned documents, a title transfer already in motion, the closing set for Monday. My brother had been meticulous. He'd left a notebook. He'd left a letter. He'd created a trust, which meant there were legal protections in place, which also meant that for any of Bridget's scheme to work, someone would have had to forge his signature, because Paul would never have signed off on a sale. He had told me more than once that the house was for Zoe, that she would have it no matter what. I put Zoe in front of a movie with a bowl of popcorn, went to my bedroom, closed the door, and called the one attorney I had in my contacts. Marlene had gone to high school with me and had spent the last decade handling estate and property law on the north side of the city. It was almost 8 o'clock at night. She picked up on the third ring because Marlene is the kind of person who has never in her adult life ignored a phone call. I told her everything. She asked me 4 precise questions. Then she went quiet for about 10 seconds. Wendy, she said, if what you're describing is accurate, they've committed deed fraud. If that trust is on file with the county, the house cannot be transferred without trustee authorization. Whatever documents they presented to the title company are forged. Another pause. We move first thing tomorrow morning. I'm filing an emergency petition with the probate court to halt the sale. And you need to get into that house and retrieve that notebook before anyone realizes what we're doing. What if Bridget finds out I know? Then she'll accelerate the timeline or start destroying what she hasn't already burned. So we make sure she doesn't find out. Marlene's voice was measured and I could hear her already typing. Text her tonight. Keep it normal. Tell her Zoe is fine. Be completely boring about it. I hung up and sat on the edge of my bed for a moment. I thought about Paul. About the way he'd spent his last year quietly, methodically doing everything he could to make sure his daughter would be safe after he was gone. He'd trusted me to catch this if it ever went wrong. I picked up my phone and texted Bridget. Zoe's all settled in. She had dinner and she's watching a movie. Hope the trip goes well. 3 minutes later, a thumbs up emoji. She had no idea. That night I lay awake running through every step. Marlene had been clear, precise, quick, and give nothing away. The moment Bridget sensed something, she'd either push the closing forward or start making the evidence disappear. In the morning, I waited until I was certain Bridget and Kent were out of town. Then I drove Zoe to Elmbrook Lane. Walking through Paul's house was harder than I expected. It still smelled faintly like him, like coffee and cedar and the particular dish soap he'd always bought in the big yellow bottle. Zoe went straight to the backyard and stood by the tire swing without saying anything, and I let her. Because sometimes grief catches you sideways in the middle of something else entirely, and you have to let it move through you before you can keep going. Then she turned and looked at me. The desk, she said. We found the notebook exactly where Paul said it would be. Locked drawer, key taped under the middle leg, just like he described. A standard black and white composition notebook, every page filled with Paul's neat, even handwriting. Account statements, trust documents, the contact information for the trustee, a man named Gerald at the wealth management firm Paul had used for years, and near the back, a section labeled simply, Concerns. He'd written down dates and amounts. Money Bridget had been quietly moving from a joint account into a separate one in the months before his death, when he'd been too sick to monitor everything closely. He'd written, I believe she is positioning herself. I am doing what I can to protect Zoe's assets. The trust is my last line. And on the very last page, near the bottom, in handwriting that looked slightly more labored than the rest, as though it had been written when he was already tired. If this is ever contested, Marlene. Wendy has her number. He had known. He had known it would be me, and he had already laid the path. I stood in that office with the notebook pressed against my chest, and I didn't cry, because I didn't have time to cry. But I made a promise to him in the quiet of that room that didn't need to be said out loud. Then I took the notebook, took Zoe's hand, and we left. Marlene worked through the weekend. I helped where I could, organizing the documents, confirming the timeline, cross-referencing the trust filing with the county recorder's records, which were exactly as Paul had documented. On file, legally binding, and irrefutable. The property could not be sold without trustee authorization. Every piece of paperwork Bridget had submitted to the title company had either been forged or obtained under false pretenses. We also reached Gerald, the trustee, who turned out to have been quietly waiting for a call exactly like this one. Paul had forewarned him too. Gerald had been monitoring the account activity. He had documentation of unauthorized transfers going back over a year. He brought all of it. Saturday evening, Bridget texted asking how Zoe was doing. I typed back, great, she's been helping me bake, having a quiet weekend. She sent a smiley face. Zoe looked over my shoulder at my phone screen, and then back up at me with an expression that was very serious and much older than 8 years old. She thinks she's already won, she said. I know, I said. That's exactly what we want her to think. By Sunday night, Marlene had filed the emergency injunction and contacted the title company directly. The title company, to their credit, responded within the hour. They had no prior knowledge of the trust's existence because the documents Bridget had submitted had deliberately omitted any mention of it. They halted the closing immediately pending court review. The buyer's real estate agent was notified. The sale was stopped cold. Monday morning, the hearing room was quiet and fluorescent, bright. Not dramatic the way I'd imagined. Just a small courtroom, a few rows of chairs, a judge with reading glasses sitting behind a raised bench, reviewing the filings with the expression of someone who had seen this exact situation more times than she would have liked. Marlene sat beside me, prepared and calm. Zoe was back at my apartment with my neighbor from 2 doors down. Bridget and Kent walked in together. I watched Bridget's face the moment she saw me. The composed pleasantness she usually wore disappeared in under 3 seconds. She leaned close to Kent and said something sharp and low. He shifted almost imperceptibly away from her. That inch of distance was the first crack. Marlene presented everything. The trust documents, the notebook, the forged signature on the deed transfer, which a handwriting analyst Marlene had retained over the weekend had flagged definitively. The unauthorized account transfers. The burned documents in the fire pit, which Zoe had witnessed and which established what Marlene called, in the clean language of law, consciousness of guilt. The correspondence between Bridget, Kent, and the buyer that had deliberately circumvented the required trustee notification. Kent's attorney leaned over and whispered something to him while Marlene was still speaking. By the time she finished, Kent had completely reoriented himself in his chair so that he was no longer sitting beside Bridget. His attorney then stood up and informed the court that his client wished to provide a statement. Kent's statement was, in essence, that all of it had been Bridget's plan, that he had believed the paperwork was legitimate, that she had reassured him everything was in order, that he had been misled. Bridget came out of her chair. The judge used her gavel once, and then again. What happened in the next 20 minutes was not clean. It was loud and fractured and ultimately futile because there was nowhere left to go. The evidence was complete. They were both trying to be the first one to hand the other to the court. And it didn't matter because the court already had everything it needed. Bridget accused Kent of orchestrating the whole thing. Kent's attorney kept requesting the floor and being interrupted. At one point, the judge had to address Bridget directly and tell her to sit down and not speak again until spoken to. When the gavel came down for the final time, the judge had ordered an immediate and permanent halt to any transactions related to the estate. She referred the matter for criminal investigation for deed fraud and breach of fiduciary duty. She noted on the record that the trust Paul had established was legally sound, properly executed, and that the attempt to circumvent it had been both deliberate and extensively documented. She further noted that the child in question had been removed from her court-appointed guardian's home under circumstances that would be reviewed for potential child abandonment. I didn't feel triumphant walking out into the hallway. I felt something more like stillness. The particular quiet that comes after a storm has finally moved through. The weeks that followed were complicated in the way legal things always are. More hearings, more filings, more phone calls with Marlene that I took in my car, in the hospital, parking lot between shifts. Bridget's guardianship was formally suspended pending the outcome of the criminal investigation. The estate was placed under Gerald's full management. The house on Elmbrook Lane was protected, exactly as Paul had intended. I petitioned the court for temporary guardianship of Zoe. I won't pretend the process was simple. There are home visits and background checks and forms that make your eyes cross after the third page. But Marlene knew the right people, and I had a clean record and a stable job, and references from colleagues who had watched me show up for Paul every single week when he was sick. The court approved it. Zoe moved into my apartment in November. She brought the gray velvet elephant, a box of her books, and a framed photograph of her and Paul from a beach trip they'd taken the summer before his diagnosis. She put the photo on the nightstand in the spare room, which I had painted yellow because she'd told me, very seriously, with her arms crossed, that yellow was her favorite color, but that she didn't want it to be a bright, happy yellow. She wanted it to be a calm yellow. She stood in front of the wall I'd painted and evaluated it for about 30 seconds before giving a single nod of approval. She started at the elementary school 3 blocks away. She made a friend in the first week, a girl named Becca who also loved elephants, which Zoe considered a very good sign. She began sleeping through the night again, something she apparently hadn't been doing for months, according to the social worker who'd interviewed her. On a Saturday in December, she asked if we could make hot chocolate the real way, with milk and cocoa powder and vanilla. So we did. Standing at the stove, she said, without looking up from the saucepan, "Do you think my dad knew you'd figure it out?" "Yes," I said, and I meant it without hesitation. She stirred slowly. "I think so too. He wrote your name in the notebook at the very end." She paused. He wrote, "Wendy will handle it." I hadn't found that line. I'd read through the whole notebook thoroughly, and somehow I'd missed it. Or maybe I hadn't been ready to find it yet. I kept my eyes on the stove for a moment and just breathed. "He was right," she said simply. Then she reached over and turned down the heat before the milk could scorch. Because she'd been watching me cook since she was 3 years old, and she knew exactly when to do that. I don't have children of my own. I hadn't planned for any of this. If you had told me a year ago that my spare bedroom would be calm yellow and someone would be correcting my stovetop technique on a Saturday morning in December, I wouldn't have known what to do with that information. But some things don't ask permission before they become your life. Some things just arrive on a cold October evening with a stuffed elephant and an envelope that was always, from the beginning, meant to find you. Standing up to Bridget, going through the courts, fighting for something when everything in me wanted to simply believe that it was someone else's responsibility. That was the hardest thing I have done as an adult. But somewhere in the middle of all of it, I learned something I hadn't been expecting to learn. Family is not a setting you're born into and never have to choose. It is a decision made over and over again. It is the choice to show up, to pay attention, to not look away when something is wrong, even when looking away would be so much easier. Paul made that choice for Zoe every day of his life, right until he couldn't anymore. He just needed someone to carry it forward. I am so glad I was the person he trusted to do it. If you were in my position, if someone you loved left behind something that needed protecting, would you have stepped in? Or would you have told yourself it wasn't your place? I really want to know. Leave it in the comments below.